The movie starts with Frank Weld, an old man who lives alone in a country house. He has mental health problems that are getting worse. At night, he keeps himself busy by robbing his own house. One day, he cleans up a little and gets ready to eat, but the milk has gone bad, so he skips breakfast and lies down on the couch. While he's dozing off, his daughter Madison calls him from a faraway country, but the phone connection cuts out. Later, Frank goes into town to visit the last library that still has real books. The librarian Jennifer greets him with a smile and says that fewer people are reading real books now. She tells Frank that a new non-profit group plans to change the library into a digital one. Just then, Frank's son Hunter calls him, and Frank leaves the library. On his way home, he stops at a store. The clerk there gives him a cold look, thinking he might be stealing. Frank ignores her and leaves the store. Hunter arrives in his car and is worried about his father's health. Hunter visits every 10 days, even though he lives far away. He's shocked by the mess in the house and says he thinks his father should go to a care facility where he can get better care. But Frank refuses to leave his home. Then Hunter shows Frank a robot assistant he bought to help take care of him. Frank doesn't like the robot because he's always been against machines doing work for people. But Hunter turns the robot on and tells it to clean the house and make lunch. The robot starts working, and soon they're sitting down to eat. Frank tries to talk to Hunter, saying that their mother wouldn't have liked this robot, but Hunter reminds him that their parents separated 30 years ago. Then the robot brings out a cake it made and tells Frank that it will be a helpful assistant. Frank reluctantly agrees to give it a chance. The next day, the robot cleans the house and starts following a daily schedule it made for Frank. It prepares healthy meals, gives Frank activities like gardening, shaves him, and even takes him for a walk. When Frank says he doesn't need the robot, it tells him that if he refuses its help, its memory will be erased and it will be put away in storage. Frank decides to accept the robot's help. One day, they go to the library, but Frank asks the robot to wait outside. Inside, Jennifer introduces Frank to Jake, the new owner of the library, and shows him the cabinet with old books that will soon be thrown away. Outside, a group of boys starts bothering the robot. When Frank comes out, he tells the robot to scare the boys next time by saying it has a self-destruct program and starting a countdown. On the way home, Frank and the robot stop by the store, where Frank steals another figurine. However, the clerk catches him and demands to see his pockets. Frank manages to put the stolen item back, and the clerk lets him go. Later, Frank is surprised to find the figurine in the robot's bag. It turns out the robot saw what happened and decided that Frank needed the item more. Frank explains the concept of theft to the robot and begins teaching it how to pick locks, revealing that he has served 2 prison terms for this skill. Frank specialized in stealing jewelry because, as he says, insurance companies are the ones who suffer the most. Seeing that the robot handles the task perfectly, Frank realizes they have new opportunities. The pair head to the library, where Frank shows the robot the locations of the security cameras. He then introduces the robot to Jennifer, who invites him to a party celebrating the library's conversion to a digital format. When they return home, Frank tells the robot that they will commit a robbery that night. At that moment, Hunter calls, tired of Madison's constant complaints and her insistence that her brother take the robot back. But now Frank doesn't want to give up his new partner. That night, the criminal duo heads to the library and steals a rare edition of Don Quixote. However, Frank doesn't realize he's left his glasses on the table at home. As Frank examines the book, he recalls how Hunter once asked him to teach him the art of theft. The old man reminisces about his children's antics, but his memories are jumbled. He deeply regrets not paying more attention to them. The next morning, Madison calls, surprised that Frank is so accepting of the robot. She gets upset when Frank mentions that her brother at least did something for him. In the evening, Frank goes to the library party with Jennifer, which is now being held at the library, which will serve as a community center. Jennifer tells him about the nighttime theft, and that Jake suspects the thieves are after the library's new sponsors. Their conversation is interrupted by Jake, who introduces his wife to the pair. He takes Jennifer away for a chat, leaving Frank alone. Frank starts eyeing the woman's jewelry, especially the necklace worn by Jake's wife. But Jake approaches the old man, admitting he knows about Frank's criminal past and about the glasses found at the scene. Jake asks Frank not to come back again. Jennifer returns, and Frank suddenly confesses that he thinks Jake is a fraud, but she doesn't understand what he means. Back at home, Frank asks the robot to turn on its visual memory. As he examines Jake's wife's jewelry, he realizes it's extremely valuable. The robot, realizing what Frank is planning, tries to dissuade him from taking the risk, but the old thief is convinced that devising a criminal plan helps him exercise his brain. They start staking out Jake's house, and during this time the robot admits it lied about its memory being wiped. It's willing to return to the store to keep Frank from risking his life, since its primary concern is Frank's health. Frank, touched by the robot's admission, asks it never to remind him that it's not alive. Later, Frank begins planning the robbery when Jennifer arrives. Fearing she'll see his notes and figure out what he's up to, he refuses the letter inside. She leaves, placing a pie on his doorstep. The next morning, Frank goes to the library to return the book to Jennifer, but hearing music coming from inside, he turns around and leaves. Later, he continues to stake out Jake's house, telling the robot more about his life. The robot continues caring for the garden and watering the ripening tomatoes. Meanwhile, Madison returns home, determined to convince her father to get rid of the machine, which she sees as ethically unacceptable. She disables the robot using a password Frank doesn't know and shows her father photos from her recent trip, unaware that it all feels burdensome to him. The next morning, Frank wakes up for the first time in a while without his mechanical friend's wake-up call. He tries to turn the robot back on, but without the password it's impossible. Madison returns from the store with cereal, which Frank has long since stopped eating because the robot only made healthy breakfasts. Watching Jake's house alone no longer brings him any pleasure. He starts rummaging through the kitchen for food, throwing everything around. Madison makes him lasagna, but Frank finds it tasteless and asks her to turn the robot back on. She refuses. Later, Frank scolds his daughter for the mess in the house, saying she hasn't done what the robot easily managed. The next morning, Frank notices a striking change. Everything is sparkling clean, and his daughter is busy in the kitchen, assuring him she spent all night cleaning. But Frank catches her in a lie. She simply turned the robot back on. Frank is outraged, saying the robot isn't a servant, and it can't just be turned on and off whenever someone wants. That night, Frank shares his robbery plan with his robot friend. He explains that the money belongs to Jake's wife, and Jake is just a freeloader. Every evening, the couple goes out to party, and that's when they'll strike. They'll steal the woman's expensive jewelry. Frank has devised 20 different escape routes to ensure their safety. Most importantly, he knows where the security system's control panel is located. At night, the man and the robot break into Jake's house and make their way to the safe. The robot, being much stronger and faster than Frank, cracks the safe, calculating millions of possible combinations. The criminal pair successfully pulls off the heist, and although the homeowners return earlier than expected, they manage to escape. But back home, Frank suddenly realizes that the stolen jewelry is too recognizable, and it won't be easy to sell. He decides to hide it for the time being. The next morning, the robot serves Frank and Madison cocktails when the sheriff arrives with Jake, who believes that Frank is behind the theft. The sheriff knows about Frank's criminal past and insists on searching the house. Madison tries to defend her father, saying she can vouch for his innocence. Later, Madison says goodbye to Frank and gives him a pair of expensive earrings that he's had for a long time. She tells him to sell them far away. Madison leaves, admitting that her brother was right about the robot. At that moment, Frank notices a van watching his house. He remembers that the sheriff came inside earlier, so he wonders if his house is being bugged. Frank turns up the TV to cover the noise and tries to figure out where to hide the stolen goods. He burns all his robbery plans in the fireplace. Then the robot reminds him that the police could check its memory. The robot asks Frank to erase its memory, but Frank doesn't want to. Feeling desperate, Frank asks the robot to call Hunter and tell him that Frank is dying. Alarmed by the message, Hunter quickly drives to his father's house and finds Frank in bed. Hunter urges Frank to go to the hospital, but Frank suddenly admits he's been a bad father and asks for Hunter's forgiveness. He asks Hunter to hide a briefcase without opening it. Hunter takes the briefcase and puts it in his car's trunk, but as soon as he drives off, the sheriff comes out of the van and stops him. When they open the briefcase, they only find a useless porcelain figurine. The sheriff tells Hunter about the robbery next door, but Hunter doesn't understand why his father is being accused since Frank is ill. Just then, Frank casually walks out onto the porch, making Hunter angry because he had rushed over in a panic. Jake realizes they can check the robot's memory to find out what really happened. The police surround the robot, but it suddenly announces that its self-destruct system has been activated and begins a countdown. When Frank sees the police rushing after him, he runs to Hunter's car and drives off with the robot. While on the road, the robot asks Frank again to erase its memory to avoid trouble. The two of them head to the library. As Frank talks to Jennifer about the recent events, he sees pictures of his children on the wall. Then he spots a photo of himself with Jennifer and suddenly remembers that she is his wife, someone he forgot because of his illness. Later, Frank and the robot sneak back home before the police can notice them. Once inside, the robot asks Frank to erase its memory so they can start over and plan a new heist. Hearing this, Frank finally agrees and shuts the robot down. Some time later, Frank ends up in an adult daycare facility as his dementia gets worse and he can barely remember anything. His family visits him and he's happy to feel their love and care. As they say goodbye, Frank slips Hunter a note, hinting that the stolen jewelry is buried under the tomatoes in the garden the robot made. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.